The question of whether morality is objective or subjective stands as one of the most fundamental and enduring debates in philosophy. This inquiry penetrates to the very core of human existence, challenging our understanding of right and wrong, good and evil, and the nature of moral truth itself. The implications of this debate extend far beyond academic philosophy, influencing legal systems, political structures, interpersonal relationships, and individual decision-making processes that shape our daily lives. At its essence, this debate asks whether moral facts exist independently of human thought, opinion, and cultural context, or whether they are constructed by and dependent upon human minds, societies, and subjective experiences. The answer to this question fundamentally alters how we approach moral reasoning, social policy, cross-cultural dialogue, and personal responsibility. Understanding both perspectives and their implications is crucial for anyone seeking to navigate the complex moral landscape of modern life. Understanding objective morality. Objective morality, also known as moral realism in philosophical circles, maintains that moral truths exist independently of what individuals or societies believe about them. According to this view, ethical sentences express propositions that refer to objective features of the world, features independent of subjective opinion, some of which may be true to the extent that they report those features accurately. Just as mathematical truths like 2 plus 2 equals 4 remain true regardless of whether anyone believes them, objective morality suggests that moral truths such as torturing innocents for pleasure is wrong hold universal validity. Proponents of objective morality argue that moral facts are discoverable through reason, observation, and careful analysis. They contend that when we make moral judgments, we are not merely expressing personal preferences or cultural conditioning, but are attempting to identify genuine moral truths that exist in the fabric of reality itself. This perspective suggests that moral disagreement stems not from the absence of moral truth, but from human error, ignorance, or bias in attempting to discern these truths. The objective view finds support in several compelling observations about human moral experience. First, the universality of certain moral intuitions across cultures suggests that some moral principles may indeed be objective features of human nature or reality. Virtually all societies prohibit unprovoked killing within their community, demonstrate some form of care for children, and recognize concepts of fairness and reciprocity, albeit with different specific applications. Second, objective moralists point to the phenomenon of moral progress as evidence for objective moral standards. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of rights to women and minorities, and the development of international human rights law suggest that humanity has been gradually discovering and implementing objective moral truths rather than simply changing arbitrary preferences. This progress implies that some moral positions are genuinely better than others, which would be impossible if morality were purely subjective. Third, the nature of moral disagreement itself suggests objectivity. When people engage in moral debates, they typically present arguments, evidence, and reasoning as if they were trying to convince others of something true, not merely expressing personal taste. As one perspective notes, to suppose that morality is subjective flies in the face of common sense and leads to the totally implausible conclusion that we can never really morally disagree with one another. If morality were purely subjective, moral arguments would be as pointless as arguing about whether chocolate tastes better than vanilla. Religious and metaphysical traditions often provide additional support for objective morality by grounding moral truths in divine command, natural law, or fundamental features of reality. These frameworks suggest that moral obligations flow from sources beyond human convention or preference, giving them objective status and universal applicability. Furthermore, objective morality offers practical advantages in terms of social coordination and moral motivation. If moral truths are objective, then moral education becomes a matter of helping people discover these truths rather than indoctrinating them with arbitrary social conventions. This can provide stronger motivation for moral behavior, as people may be more inclined to act morally if they believe they are conforming to genuine truths rather than merely following social expectations. Understanding subjective morality. Subjective morality, encompassing various forms of moral anti-realism, maintains that moral judgments are not objective truths, but rather expressions of human attitudes, emotions, cultural practices, or individual preferences. This position argues that moral truths are not objective, but are instead subject to human sentiment, thought, or cultural practice. Rather than discovering pre-existing moral facts, humans create moral systems to serve their needs, preferences, and social functions. The subjective perspective encompasses several distinct philosophical positions. Emotivism suggests that moral statements are simply expressions of approval or disapproval, much like saying hooray or boo. Prescriptivism maintains that moral judgments are commands or recommendations rather than truth-apt statements. Cultural relativism argues that moral truths are relative to particular societies or cultures, while individual subjectivism claims that moral truths are relative to individual persons. Proponents of subjective morality point to the tremendous diversity of moral beliefs across cultures and throughout history as evidence against objective moral truths. If moral truths were objective and discoverable, they argue, we would expect to see more convergence in moral beliefs, rather than the dramatic variations we observe. The fact that practices considered abhorrent in one culture may be celebrated in another suggests that moral judgments reflect cultural conditioning rather than objective truth. The subjective view also draws support from evolutionary explanations of moral behavior. If our moral intuitions evolved as adaptive mechanisms for promoting cooperation and survival within social groups, then what we experience as moral truth may actually be the result of biological programming rather than insight into objective moral reality. Our moral emotions and intuitions, while powerful and seemingly authoritative, may simply reflect evolutionary solutions to social coordination problems rather than perception of objective moral facts. Psychological research further supports subjective accounts by revealing the extent to which moral judgments are influenced by factors that seem irrelevant to moral truth. Studies show that moral judgments can be affected by physical cleanliness, emotional states, cultural background, and even genetic variations. This suggests that what people experience as moral truth may actually be the product of psychological and cultural forces rather than genuine moral insight. The subjective perspective also addresses the problem of moral motivation more directly than objective accounts. If moral judgments are expressions of our attitudes and emotions, then it becomes clearer why they motivate action. We are naturally inclined to act in accordance with our attitudes and emotions, but it is less clear why objective moral facts, existing independently of our psychology, should necessarily motivate us to act. Additionally, subjective morality aligns with broader trends in human thought that recognize the constructed nature of many concepts we once thought were objective. Just as we have come to understand that concepts like beauty, meaning, and value are human constructions rather than objective features of reality, moral anti-realists argue that moral concepts should be understood similarly. The subjective view also offers greater tolerance for moral diversity. If moral truths are relative to cultures or individuals, then different moral systems may be equally valid within their respective contexts. This perspective can promote understanding and acceptance across cultural boundaries while avoiding the potential imperialism of claiming that one's own moral system captures objective truth. The middle ground. Between the poles of pure objectivity and pure subjectivity lies a range of intermediate positions that attempt to capture insights from both perspectives while avoiding their respective weaknesses. These approaches recognize that morality is neither completely independent of human thought nor completely arbitrary, but rather emerges from the interaction between human nature, social needs, and rational reflection. Intersubjective approaches argue that moral truths emerge from shared human experiences and rational dialogue rather than existing independently of human thought or being purely individual preferences. According to this view, moral truths are objective, in the sense that they are not merely matters of individual taste, but they are also not independent of human thought and social interaction. Instead, they are constructed through processes of social dialogue, mutual understanding, and collective reasoning. This perspective suggests that moral truths are discovered and created simultaneously through the process of human social interaction. As people with different perspectives engage in moral dialogue, they may discover common ground that reflects shared human needs and experiences, while also creating new moral understandings that transcend individual viewpoints. The resulting moral truths have a kind of objectivity because they are not reducible to individual preferences, but they are also clearly dependent on human thought and social interaction. Constructivist approaches to morality emphasize the role of rational reflection and social construction in creating moral systems. According to constructivism, moral principles are neither discovered as pre-existing truths nor arbitrary expressions of preference, but are constructed through processes of rational reflection on human needs, desires, and social conditions. These constructed principles can be evaluated and improved through further reflection and experience, giving them a kind of objectivity, while acknowledging their human origin. The contractualist tradition in moral philosophy, exemplified by philosophers like John Rawls, offers another middle ground approach. Contractualism argues that moral principles are those that would be chosen by rational agents under fair conditions. While these principles are not independent of human thought and choice, they are also not arbitrary because they are constrained by requirements of rationality and fairness. This approach suggests that moral truths are objective in the sense that they are the unique solutions to problems of social cooperation under conditions of rationality and fairness. Evolutionary approaches to morality also occupy middle ground by suggesting that while our moral capacities evolved through natural selection, the specific moral principles we develop through rational reflection and social interaction may capture genuine truths about how rational social beings should live together. This view acknowledges the biological basis of moral capacity, while maintaining that moral reasoning can transcend its evolutionary origins to discover objective principles. These intermediate positions offer several advantages over pure objectivist or subjectivist approaches. They can account for both the universal aspects of morality that suggest objectivity and the cultural variation that suggests subjectivity. They explain why moral dialogue seems meaningful while acknowledging the role of human construction in moral systems. They provide resources for moral criticism and progress, while avoiding claims about mind-independent moral facts that many find metaphysically problematic. Cultural and historical perspectives. Examining morality across cultures and throughout history provides crucial evidence for evaluating objective and subjective accounts. The anthropological record reveals both striking similarities and dramatic differences in moral systems across human societies, creating a complex picture that both objectivists and subjectivists can use to support their positions. Universal moral tendencies across cultures provide some support for objective morality. Virtually all human societies exhibit prohibitions against unprovoked killing within the community, some form of care and protection for children, concepts of reciprocity and fairness in exchange relationships, and recognition of certain forms of promise-keeping or truth-telling. These universals suggest that there may be objective constraints on viable moral systems, whether grounded in human nature, practical necessities of social cooperation, or genuine moral truths. However, the specific content and application of these universal tendencies varies dramatically across cultures in ways that challenge simple objectivist accounts. While all cultures prohibit some forms of killing, they differ dramatically in which killings are prohibited and which are required or permitted. Some societies practice infanticide under certain circumstances, others require killing as part of religious rituals or honor codes, and still others extend prohibitions against killing to non-human animals or even plants. Similarly, while all cultures recognize some forms of reciprocity and fairness, they differ in their specific conceptions of what fairness requires. Some societies emphasize equal treatment, others prioritize need-based distribution, and still others focus on merit or contribution. Some cultures value individual rights and autonomy, while others prioritize collective harmony and social role fulfillment. Historical change in moral beliefs within cultures also presents challenges for both objective and subjective accounts. If moral truths are objective, then moral progress should represent genuine discovery of these truths. The abolition of slavery, expansion of political rights, and development of human rights concepts may indeed represent moral progress in this sense. However, historical moral change has not been uniformly progressive, and many changes seem to reflect shifting social conditions, power relationships, and practical needs rather than moral discovery. The subjective account can more easily accommodate moral diversity and change by explaining them as reflections of different cultural conditions, social needs, and historical circumstances. However, this approach struggles to explain why some moral changes seem clearly progressive while others seem regressive, and why cross-cultural moral criticism often seems legitimate and effective. Religious traditions add another layer of complexity to cultural perspectives on morality. Many religious systems claim objective moral truth based on divine revelation or natural law, but these systems often conflict with each other and change over time. The fact that religious moral systems are deeply embedded in cultural contexts while claiming transcultural validity illustrates the complex relationship between objective and subjective elements in moral thinking. Globalization and cross-cultural contact have created new challenges and opportunities for understanding moral objectivity and subjectivity. As different moral systems encounter each other, they must either defend their claims to universal validity or acknowledge their cultural specificity. The development of international human rights law represents an attempt to identify universal moral principles, but this effort remains controversial and contested. The study of moral psychology across cultures has revealed both universal patterns in moral reasoning and significant cultural variation in moral concerns and priorities. All cultures seem to recognize moral domains related to harm, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity, but they vary dramatically in the relative importance placed on these different moral concerns. This suggests that while human moral capacity may be universal, its specific development and application are culturally variable. Implications for ethics and society. The debate between objective and subjective morality has profound implications for how societies organize themselves, make collective decisions, and interact with other cultures. These implications touch on fundamental questions of law, politics, education, and international relations. In legal systems, the question of moral objectivity affects how laws are justified and interpreted. If morality is objective, then laws should ideally conform to objective moral truths, and legal systems can be criticized for failing to implement these truths. This provides a basis for natural law theories of jurisprudence and for criticizing unjust laws as violations of objective moral standards. However, it also raises difficult questions about how objective moral truths are to be identified and implemented in diverse societies with different moral beliefs. If morality is subjective, then laws cannot be justified by appeal to objective moral truth, but must be understood as social contracts, expressions of cultural values, or pragmatic solutions to coordination problems. This approach may be more tolerant of legal diversity across cultures, but provides fewer resources for criticizing legal systems or advocating for legal reform based on moral grounds. Political theory is similarly affected by views about moral objectivity. Democratic theory often assumes that political decisions should reflect the will of the people, but this assumption becomes problematic if moral truths are objective. If there are objective answers to moral and political questions, then the majority opinion may be morally irrelevant or even counterproductive if the majority is mistaken about moral truth. This creates tension between democratic legitimacy and moral correctness that has been central to political philosophy for centuries. Authoritarian systems may claim to implement objective moral truths more effectively than democratic systems by removing political decisions from popular control and placing them in the hands of moral experts or revealed truth. However, such systems face the problem of identifying genuine moral expertise and avoiding the abuse of claims to moral authority for self-interested purposes. Educational policy is also significantly affected by views about moral objectivity. If morality is objective, then moral education should focus on helping students discover moral truths through reason, tradition, or revelation. This approach supports traditional approaches to moral education that emphasize teaching specific moral principles and developing character traits aligned with objective moral standards. If morality is subjective, then moral education becomes more complex and potentially problematic. Schools might focus on helping students understand different moral perspectives, develop skills for moral reasoning, and make informed choices about their own moral commitments. However, this approach may be seen as relativistic or nihilistic by those who believe in objective moral standards, and it raises questions about whether schools can or should avoid taking positions on contested moral issues. International relations and human rights discourse are particularly affected by debates about moral objectivity. The concept of universal human rights assumes that there are objective moral truths about how all human beings should be treated regardless of their cultural background. This provides a basis for criticizing human rights violations and intervening in the affairs of other nations to protect human rights. However, cultural relativist perspectives challenge the universality of human rights concepts by arguing that moral truths are relative to cultural contexts. This view suggests that international human rights discourse may be a form of cultural imperialism that imposes Western moral concepts on non-Western societies. The tension between universal human rights and cultural diversity remains a central challenge in international relations. Cross-cultural dialogue and cooperation are similarly affected by views about moral objectivity. If morality is objective, then cross-cultural moral disagreements reflect differences in moral knowledge rather than fundamental incompatibility, and dialogue aimed at discovering moral truth may be productive. If morality is subjective, then cross-cultural dialogue must focus on finding pragmatic solutions to shared problems rather than seeking moral truth, and tolerance for moral diversity becomes more important than moral agreement. Implications for individual life and relationships. Beyond its societal implications, the objective-subjective morality debate profoundly shapes how individuals understand their moral obligations, make personal decisions, and relate to others. The position one takes on this fundamental question influences everything from personal identity formation to intimate relationships and professional conduct. For individuals who embrace objective morality, moral decision-making becomes a process of discovery and alignment. Personal moral growth involves developing better understanding of objective moral truths and stronger commitment to living in accordance with them. This perspective can provide deep meaning and purpose by connecting individual choices to universal truths that transcend personal preference and social convention. It offers a foundation for moral conviction and the courage to stand against social pressure when one believes objective moral truth is at stake. However, objective morality can also create psychological burden and interpersonal conflict. If moral truths are objective, then moral mistakes are not merely matters of personal preference, but genuine errors that may have serious consequences. This can lead to perfectionism, guilt, and anxiety about making the right moral choices. It can also fuel moral judgment of others and difficulty accepting moral diversity within relationships and communities. The objective view affects how individuals handle moral disagreement in personal relationships. When conflicts arise over moral issues, objective morality suggests that someone must be wrong, and resolution requires discovering which position aligns with objective moral truth. This can make moral disagreements feel high stakes and difficult to resolve through compromise or mutual acceptance of differences. For those who embrace subjective morality, moral decision-making becomes more focused on personal authenticity, social harmony, and practical consequences. Individual moral development involves clarifying one's own values, understanding their origins and implications, and learning to navigate moral diversity in social relationships. This perspective can reduce moral anxiety and promote tolerance for different approaches to moral questions. However, subjective morality can also lead to moral relativism that provides insufficient resources for making difficult moral decisions or maintaining moral conviction in the face of opposition. If moral judgments are merely expressions of preference, it may become difficult to maintain strong commitments to moral principles or to criticize moral behavior that causes harm. The subjective view may handle moral disagreement in relationships more easily by treating such disagreements as differences in values or preferences rather than conflicts over truth. This can facilitate compromise and mutual acceptance while potentially reducing the depth and significance attributed to moral commitments. Parenting and moral education of children are particularly affected by one's position on moral objectivity. Parents who believe in objective morality typically focus on teaching their children specific moral principles and helping them develop character traits aligned with moral truth. They may emphasize moral reasoning skills that help children discover objective moral principles and provide clear guidance about right and wrong behavior. Parents who view morality as subjective face more complex challenges in moral education. They may focus on helping children understand different moral perspectives, develop empathy and social skills, and learn to make thoughtful decisions about their own moral commitments. However, they must also provide sufficient moral guidance to help children develop healthy social relationships and avoid harmful behavior. Personal identity formation is also influenced by views about moral objectivity. Those who believe in objective morality may develop identity around alignment with universal moral truths, finding meaning in conforming to principles that transcend individual preference. Those who view morality as subjective may develop identity around authentic expression of personal values and successful navigation of social relationships. Professional ethics and career decisions reflect these different approaches as well. Objective morality provides clearer guidance for ethical decision-making in professional contexts by offering universal principles that should guide behavior regardless of personal preference or institutional pressure. Subjective morality requires more attention to stakeholder perspectives, cultural context, and negotiated solutions to ethical dilemmas. The therapeutic and counseling implications also differ significantly. Therapy approaches based on objective morality might focus on helping clients align their behavior with moral truth and develop character traits consistent with virtue. Approaches based on subjective morality might emphasize helping clients clarify their own values, understand the sources of their moral commitments, and develop skills for navigating moral complexity in relationships and social contexts. Contemporary developments and future directions. The objective-subjective morality debate continues to evolve in response to new developments in psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and social theory. These developments are providing new evidence and theoretical frameworks that both support and challenge traditional positions while opening up novel approaches to understanding moral phenomena. Recent research in moral psychology has revealed the complex psychological processes underlying moral judgment and has challenged traditional philosophical assumptions about moral reasoning. Studies show that moral judgments often occur rapidly and intuitively, with conscious reasoning playing a secondary role in justifying decisions that have already been made emotionally. This research suggests that what people experience as moral reasoning may actually be post hoc rationalization of intuitive responses. These findings support subjective accounts of morality by suggesting that moral judgments reflect emotional and cultural conditioning rather than rational insight into objective truth. However, they also raise questions about the reliability of moral intuitions and the possibility of moral progress through rational reflection, challenges that affect both objective and subjective approaches. Neuroscience research has identified brain systems involved in moral judgment and has revealed how different types of moral reasoning activate different neural networks. Some studies suggest that utilitarian moral reasoning activates different brain areas than deontological moral reasoning, and that individual differences in moral judgment may reflect differences in brain structure and function. This research provides support for naturalistic approaches to morality that ground moral phenomena in biological processes, but it does not clearly resolve questions about moral objectivity. Some argue that the biological basis of moral judgment supports objective accounts by showing that moral capacity is part of human nature, while others argue that it supports subjective accounts by showing that moral judgments reflect evolved psychological mechanisms rather than perception of moral truth. Evolutionary approaches to morality have become increasingly sophisticated, offering detailed accounts of how moral emotions, intuitions, and reasoning capacities may have evolved to solve problems of social cooperation. These approaches suggest that many moral phenomena that seem to point toward objective moral truth may actually reflect evolutionary solutions to adaptive problems. However, evolutionary approaches also raise questions about the relationship between the evolutionary origins of moral capacity and the validity of moral judgments. Some argue that evolutionary explanations debunk moral claims by showing that they reflect biological programming rather than moral truth, while others maintain that evolutionary explanations are compatible with moral objectivity if evolution has equipped us with capacities for perceiving moral truth. Advances in cross-cultural psychology and anthropology continue to provide new data about moral diversity and universality across human cultures. While this research confirms significant variation in moral beliefs and practices, it also reveals deeper universal patterns in moral concern and reasoning that suggest constraints on viable moral systems. Artificial intelligence and machine ethics represent emerging challenges for both objective and subjective approaches to morality. If moral truths are objective, then it should in principle be possible to program machines to recognize and implement these truths. However, the practical difficulty of creating moral AI systems highlights the complexity of moral reasoning and the challenge of specifying moral principles clearly enough for computational implementation. If morality is subjective, then machine ethics requires determining whose subjective moral views should be implemented in AI systems and how conflicts between different moral perspectives should be resolved. This challenge is becoming increasingly practical as AI systems are deployed in contexts that require moral decision-making. Environmental ethics and the challenge of climate change have also raised new questions about moral objectivity and subjectivity. Issues of intergenerational justice, obligations to non-human nature, and global cooperation on environmental problems seem to require universal moral principles that transcend cultural differences and individual preferences. However, the diversity of cultural approaches to environmental issues and the influence of economic and political interests on environmental policy suggest that subjective factors play major roles in environmental moral reasoning. The development of global communication technologies and social media has created new contexts for moral dialogue and disagreement that challenge traditional approaches to both objective and subjective morality. Online interactions often involve people from different cultural backgrounds with different moral assumptions, creating opportunities for both moral learning and moral conflict. The speed and emotional intensity of online communication can amplify moral disagreements while making the kind of careful reasoning that might lead to moral progress more difficult. Looking towards the future, several trends are likely to influence the continuing development of this debate. Increasing cultural contact and globalization will continue to highlight questions about moral universality and cultural specificity. Advances in psychology and neuroscience will provide new understanding of the mechanisms underlying moral judgment. The development of artificial intelligence will force more precise specification of moral principles and their implementation. Environmental challenges will test the adequacy of existing moral frameworks for addressing global problems. Conclusion and synthesis. The question of whether morality is objective or subjective remains one of the most fundamental and contentious issues in philosophy, with profound implications for individual life and social organization. After examining the arguments, evidence, and implications on both sides, it becomes clear that this debate is unlikely to be resolved definitively through purely philosophical arguments. Instead, the most productive approach may be to recognize the insights and limitations of both perspectives while developing more nuanced understandings that capture the complexity of moral phenomena. The objective morality position captures important aspects of moral experience, including the universal character of many moral concerns, the phenomenon of moral progress, and the serious way people engage in moral disagreement. It provides resources for moral criticism, social reform, and cross-cultural dialogue about shared moral problems. However, it faces significant challenges in explaining moral diversity, cultural variation, and the psychological mechanisms underlying moral judgment. The subjective morality position better accounts for moral diversity, cultural variation, and the psychological basis of moral judgment. It avoids metaphysical commitments to mind-independent moral facts that many find problematic and provides frameworks for understanding moral development and change. However, it struggles to account for the apparent objectivity of moral experience and may provide insufficient resources for moral criticism and social reform. Intermediate positions that emphasize intersubjective construction, rational dialogue, and evolutionary constraints on moral systems offer promising approaches that may capture insights from both objective and subjective perspectives. These approaches recognize that morality is neither completely independent of human thought nor completely arbitrary, but emerges from the complex interaction between human nature, social needs, rational reflection, and cultural development. Perhaps the most important insight from this extended analysis is that the objective-subjective distinction itself may be too simple to capture the full complexity of moral phenomena. Morality may be objective in some respects and subjective in others, or it may involve forms of objectivity that are different from the mind independence typically assumed by traditional objective approaches. Rather than seeking a final answer to whether morality is objective or subjective, we might be better served by continuing to develop our understanding of how moral systems function, how moral judgments are formed and justified, and how moral dialogue can be made more productive across different perspectives and cultures. This ongoing inquiry is itself a moral enterprise that requires the kinds of careful reasoning, empathetic understanding, and commitment to truth that both objective and subjective approaches to morality seek to foster. The practical implications of this debate will continue to shape law, politics, education, and personal relationships, regardless of how the theoretical issues are ultimately resolved. Understanding the different perspectives and their implications can help individuals and societies make more informed choices about how to structure moral education, legal systems, and social institutions, while remaining open to moral learning and development. In the end, the debate between objective and subjective morality may be most valuable, not for the final answer it provides, but for the careful thinking about moral phenomena that it encourages and the insights into human nature and social life that emerge from this ongoing investigation. Whether morality is ultimately objective, subjective, or something more complex, the human capacity for moral reasoning, concern for others, and commitment to principles that transcend immediate self-interest remains a remarkable and valuable aspect of human experience that deserves continued study, development, and respect.